The deadline is what the document cannot survive. A national chip self-sufficiency plan wrote a number into its own body, attached a year to that number, and then arrived at the year. What the plan contains at that arrival is not a verdict. What it contains is the number it started with, still standing, unreported against, as though the year had not come. We will read this document twice. First, for what it plainly establishes: the target, the year, the categories, the stated logic. Then for what it declines to record at the moment the deadline became the present tense. The protagonist is the plan. The story is what the plan chose never to measure in writing. The one document throughout is China's semiconductor self-sufficiency target, as articulated in the Made in China 2025 policy framework and the industrial guidance that followed it. The plan stated, in figures that appeared in policy documents and were cited in subsequent industrial direction, that domestic production should satisfy roughly 40% of China's chip demand by 2020, rising to approximately 70% by 2025. A percentage and a year. The plan names semiconductors alongside aerospace, robotics, and advanced materials as priority sectors. But the chip target acquired a specificity the others did not. The others expressed direction. The chip target expressed a number, a benchmark the document invited the world to hold it against. The plan's first reading is therefore unusually legible for a document of its kind. It does not rest on directional language alone. It names categories of chip, logic, memory, power semiconductors, compound semiconductors. It identifies the domestic fabless design industry and domestic foundry capacity as the two pillars the percentage would rest on. It acknowledges, plainly, that China imports the vast majority of the semiconductors it consumes. At the time of writing, the import bill ran to well over $200 billion annually, making chips China's largest import category by value, exceeding crude oil. That sentence is the plan's own honest accounting of the dependency it intends to close. The stated mechanism is also in the text. State-guided investment funds, established in 2014, would channel capital toward domestic manufacturers. The plan does not name foreign technology restrictions as a driver. It frames the target as an industrial modernization objective. That framing is the first thing worth noting on a first reading, because it is the thing that earns the closest attention when you read the document again. Read the plan a second time at the deadline it wrote for itself, and the first thing it does not contain is a verdict. The plan establishes a 70% target by 2025. The plan does not establish whether 70% was reached. That is not a bureaucratic oversight. National industrial plans of this kind typically generate formal review documents, progress reports, updated targets. The absence of a publicly available authoritative accounting from the plan's own authors of where the number landed is itself a line of the record. The plan generated a promise. The promise does not appear to have generated a public ledger. Analyst estimates, which must be held separately from the plan's own claims, suggest the achieved self-sufficiency rate as of the mid-2020s is substantially below 70%. Figures cited in industry reporting and by research institutions range roughly between 15 and 25% for domestic production as a share of domestic consumption by volume, with the gap widening when measured at the most advanced process nodes. Those figures are contested, and the methodology matters enormously. Measuring chip self-sufficiency as a percentage shifts depending on whether you count chips designed by Chinese firms but fabricated abroad, chips assembled in China from foreign-sourced wafers, or only chips where design, fabrication, and packaging all occur within domestic borders. The plan does not specify which definition applies to its 70% figure. That is an omission that makes the target simultaneously ambitious and unmeasurable, and the record does not say which version of the question its authors believed they were answering. The second reading's most consequential silence concerns the categories the plan names. It lists the segments. It does not, at the deadline, record which segments reached the target and which did not. What industry reporting and analyst work suggest, again hedged as estimates rather than as the plan's own accounting, is that the trajectory across categories diverged sharply. Power semiconductors and mature node logic, where Chinese manufacturers had been building capacity for years, came closer to meaningful domestic penetration. Leading-edge logic at the most advanced process nodes and dynamic random access memory at competitive specifications remained largely outside domestic reach by the time the deadline arrived. The plan's single percentage obscures a disaggregated reality. It was never designed to surface. The record shows a number. The number does not disclose the composition behind it. Then there is the date itself. The 2025 target did not visibly move in official language. The plan continued to be cited with its original figures. But the industrial ambition it described quietly acquired a longer horizon in subsequent policy statements and five-year plan language. Investment targets extended. New funds were announced. The conversation shifted from meeting the 2025 benchmark to sustaining the trajectory beyond it. The plan does not record this shift. It remains, in its original text, a document with a 2025 deadline and a 70% figure, neither of which it ever formally retired. A target that was not extended in the original document was also never formally closed. One phrasing from the first reading earns closer attention on this second pass. The plan frames the self-sufficiency target as an industrial modernization objective and does not name foreign technology restrictions as a motivating condition. By the time the deadline arrived, the landscape the plan was silent about had become the dominant fact of the semiconductor industry. The additions to the United States Entity List beginning in 2019, the foreign direct product rule expansions targeting advanced chip manufacturing equipment and leading-edge chips, the controls on extreme ultraviolet lithography access enforced through the Dutch lithography maker, none of this appears in the plan's original text, because the plan predates the sharpest of these measures. The document is therefore a record of an ambition formed before the restriction that most accelerated its urgency. Reading it at the deadline means reading a plan written for one world against the conditions of another, and the plan cannot speak to that distance because it was written before the distance existed. The plan does not record its own methodology for calculating the 70% figure, which means any external calculation of achievement is measuring a different thing from an unknown original. The plan does not record which data sources its authors considered authoritative, so Analyst estimates that diverge from one another are not necessarily wrong. They may simply be answering a different version of the question. The plan does not record what conditions would constitute a formal revision of the target, so the absence of a public downward revision cannot be read as a claim of success. It may equally reflect that the plan never built in a mechanism for publicly recording that the target was missed, and the plan does not record what happens after 2025. The subsequent policy documents are related, but distinct texts, and reading continuity between them requires inferences the record does not license on its own. What the document leaves open, the definition of its own benchmark, the identity of its authoritative scorekeeper, the procedure for its own revision, is not incidental to the plan's architecture. A target that cannot be formally failed is also a target that cannot be formally met, and the plan, read at its deadline, sits in exactly that space. The plan, read twice, establishes this. A specific number was written into a national industrial document with a specific year attached, during a period when the restriction that would most accelerate the plan's urgency had not yet been imposed. At the deadline, neither the plan nor any document that formally supersedes it records what the number became. The ambition is in the text. The ledger is in the silence. The wall, when it arrived in the form of export controls and equipment restrictions enforced through foreign suppliers and rulemaking in Washington, did not appear in the plan. But the plan was the thing the wall produced a race against, and the race's outcome is not disclosed at that granularity in any document the plan generated. What a document chooses not to close is sometimes more precisely informative than what it chose to open. If the plan does not record its own score, there is another document that might. The fine print of the export rule, written by the side that imposed the restriction, describes exactly which capabilities it believed it was constraining, and that document has its own conspicuous silences about the capabilities it did not anticipate. That text is the next one to read closely. If that kind of reading is the one you want more of, the subscribe button is how you make sure you see it when it arrives.